So now that we've got our saving and loading basically working, and we've got encryption working in our favor as well to secure our files, let's go ahead and implement the interface through which we can save and load our files. I'm going to want to import a couple items. These are some graphics that we'll use within the next couple episodes. So inside our main folder, I'm going to come over to my graphics inside of UI, and I'm going to drag the items in here. These items will be available for download, so make sure you go grab those or use your own. Next thing we want to do is we just want to make sure that all these items that have been imported are imported as sprites. So let's change that input type from default to sprite 2D and apply. Next, we're going to want to design the interface, and this is not going to be something that we want captured in our screenshots when we save the files, so we will of course implement that in the overlay canvas. So we've only got one thing in here, which is our history logs, so let's go ahead and create a new panel under UI panel and make this our save and load menu. Now, the save and load menu is going to work with a couple other menus. Well, you'll be able to pull them up in the same way, and I think I'm going to have them all use the same background. So that background is going to be the settings menu background image that I have. So another canvas that we'll make is for our config menu. The config and the save and load menu may be accessed from the same location. So under canvas overlay, I'm also going to create a new panel for my config page. And then visual novels also typically have a help page where you can look at the controls that show you how to play it. So let's create another UI panel for help. And then for all of these, I'm just going to make one more panel. I can never seem to remember where that's located. And I'm just going to call this menus. And all three of these are going to be underneath of menus, and I'm going to remove the image component off of each of them. And I'm also going to remove the image off of the menus panel there. And then create, I guess I'll just make it empty so I don't keep creating panels. I'll make it empty and call this pages. The save and load, config, and help menu are all pages that are part of the menus group. Okay, so the save and load, config, and help menu, they're all what we're going to call pages. So I'm going to create an empty, and if we're in the editor view, we can see that it spawns as this tiny little box. So let's choose the Rect Transform tools, hold Control-Shift-Alt, and expand it to the edges with the anchors and the Rect Transform. And I'm just going to call this pages. Each one of these things is a page in our menus, and we can access them independently. But then what that allows us to do is let's make another empty, make sure it's scaled all the way up, and take it behind the pages, and this will be the shared background that all of them use. So let me go ahead and make a new panel under here, and give it the settings menu background. And to tie it all together, I'm going to make one more empty, which is going to be the root of the menus page. They'll all be animated using this root to have them come in and show up in the scene. So I'll go ahead and expand that, and just make sure that the background and the pages are both parented to the root. And I'll also give the root a canvas group to control the visibility. That way with it, I can show and hide all the panels at once, whichever may be active. So if we were to look at this in the game view, this is what it would look like. And I'm just going to take up the visibility of the background panel just a little bit so it hides the background a little better. And I'll also decorate it up by adding a new panel called Decor, which is going to have this visual novel overlay. And that'll just give a little extra design to what's on the page. Next, no matter what page I'm on, I want there to be a navigation menu down at the bottom where I can navigate between the different menus available to me, such as returning back to the visual novel, accessing the config menu, accessing the save and load screen, returning back home to the main menu of the visual novel, finding the help menu, or even quitting the game. I want it to all be accessible from down here. So under root, I'm also going to create a new object, come back to the scene view, and this is going to be a bar at the very bottom of the screen. We want to make sure it's underneath all of these, but not a child of the pages, so that way everything underneath it will show up on top of the pages no matter what we're on. And so how about we go ahead and make our navigation buttons? Let's go ahead and create a new UI button with TextMesh Pro so we get some good quality here. For right now, at least, I think I'm going to use the choice button as the button background, and also set the text to a different font and its font size to something that fits the button. And so this text is going to be return, as this will be the button that returns me to the menu. Now, here comes the important part. For our navigation bar, let me go ahead and make a horizontal layout group. And the return bar, I'll go ahead and add a layout element to it. And set the preferred width and the preferred height. So the navigation bar will now have all of the buttons that we'll create line up in a row horizontally. But I'm going to set the pivot point to the middle center. So that way, as I start adding more buttons, they'll go ahead and start spacing out. Now, maybe I don't want them spaced out like so. Maybe I would like instead to have them fairly close together, in which case I'll uncheck Child Force Expand Width, and then they'll show up side by side, and I can create whatever buttons I want. And so these are the buttons that I'm adding. Return, Config, which will take us to our config menu where we can edit the volume and the text speed and all sorts of things. Save menu where we can save our game to any of the files that we have available to us. Load where we can do the opposite and load it. Home to take us back to the main menu, when we create the main menu, that is. Help, which will show us the controls and how to run the visual novel. And quit to exit the desktop once we actually make this an application. But I think I'd like to spice up the text a little bit, other than just having a different font, so let's go to the font asset up here. Give it a click, and we'll see right in here we can find the asset. So if you expand that, you can see that there is a material in here. And that material is linked to this particular font, and that's where it's rendering, where it's getting its render properties for the screen. So we can actually duplicate this, and we'll go ahead and rename this to something like, I'm going to make this the menu text. And so now what will happen, if we access the text here, we can go ahead and select Material Preset, and then we will see the duplicated item because it's still linked, and we can just select it here. And as we select that, now we have a new font material to work with where we can customize it the way that we want. So if I were to go ahead and select that item, I can add, say, an outline. Maybe I'll do some kind of gold outline. And we can see it affect the bottom there. So I only need to make sure that all of these other text elements are using that same material preset. And then they all get the outline to them. So let's start simple and create the first page, which is going to be our help menu. Let's open up Pages and go to Help, and then create a new UI object in here, which is basically going to be just a little text object. This text object is going to be the size of whatever it is that we want to do here. Maybe I will go ahead and create a little default panel that I can duplicate on all of these, and it will basically be the rendering space that we're allotted per page. So I'll just make another empty, and it's going to be a default size, but I'm going to scale up the bounds to be about where I want the content to fit. So something like this might be good for all of our different pages. As long as everything fits within these bounds, it's all going to be uniform and it's going to look fairly good. So I'll just actually rename this to content, and I'll duplicate that twice and give one to our config and our save and load menu. And now they all have a content section. So for help, what I'm going to put in here is just that TextMesh Pro object. So we can add whatever controls we're going to use, and how about we also make a title field right up above. That title is just going to be scaled how I need it, and it's going to represent the page that is currently open, in this case, help. So for the controls, I'll enter whatever buttons do some actions in the game. In this case, left, click, enter, and space, they represent moving forward, left arrow, right arrow, that's our history stuff, and the tilde shows our history logs. If I want to show what that represents side by side and have it neatly organized, then I may just make two text fields here, and have the other one aligned to the right. And so then I would say that this is advance through game, and then left arrow and right arrow move through history, and then the tilde is the open and close history log. Now if I select them both at once and then scroll to the spacing options, I can change the line spacing for whatever I need as well. So I can space it out and it looks a little better. Next, I'm going to make sure I select all of my content items that I made and just give them all a canvas group so I can control their alpha. And let me go ahead and set help to 0 because I'm not going to be working with that right now. The next thing let's work with is our config menu, where we can change the settings related to our visual novel. So for this, we're also going to have a title field, just like we did for our help, so I'll duplicate that and just move it into the configs content. And I'll change that to config, or maybe I'll change it to settings. The settings of the visual novel. Next thing I'll want is a banner up at the top. That way we'll be able to navigate through the different kinds of settings, such as we'll have settings that are general, such as maybe our display settings and our resolution and text speed and what have you, and then we can have another page for, say, audio, and we could just make different pages for each of our settings. So let's make a header where we can select whatever page it is we're going to be working on. So inside of content, I'm also going to create another empty, and this is going to be for our panel selection header. And I'm just going to scale this to about the size that I want the header to be, which may be something like this. Now this header is going to have an image component on it, and it's going to be black, which I'm going to make slightly transparent. And I'm also going to create a child, which will be a button. So it'll be kind of like our navigation menu down here. As a matter of fact, that's pretty much what we're going to be duplicating. So I'm going to take and duplicate a button from there and just move it up into my return menu. And then I'll go ahead and drag that button up to the top and just make sure that it fits. Which that may be a little small. Let me just scale down the text a little bit. Definitely a little too small. And I decided to remove the choice button background and just make it a flat black box, which is again slightly transparent, and increase the text size. That's why it's a little more readable. Now this panel selection header is going to have a horizontal layout group just like we did before. And I'm going to make sure that the spacing and the child alignment is set to middle center, or middle left rather, so they start at the left and gradually make their way over. But I will increase the padding just a little bit. And again, I'm going to uncheck Child Force Expand, and then just set the spacing to something like 15. And now let's go ahead and duplicate it, and instead of general, what we're going to have is audio settings. Now that we've got our panel selection header, let's go ahead and make the section for our panels. So I'll make another empty, and this one is going to scale up to the entire size, but I'm going to bring the top down to where the header begins. And I'll also go ahead and drag the anchor down with it. So this is going to be the container for all of the different panels, which will hold the settings that we can configure. The first one we're going to create, let's go ahead and scale it up to the right size. This is going to be for our general settings. Going to name it the same thing as we have for our other tabs up there. So general and audio. Now both of these, they're also going to have a background. So I'll set an image, set it to black, and then just take the transparency down a little bit. And remember, UI design is completely up to personal taste. Feel free to experiment and do whatever you will with it. So right off the bat, I'll go ahead and make sure that audio is disabled, and let's just go ahead and focus on what we have in the general settings. Now first of all, both of these are going to have a vertical layout group to them. Now, each of these items is going to have a scroll view. That way, if we have more settings that may not be visible on screen, maybe we have too many configurations, we can just scroll right through them. So right-click General, UI, and let's do a scroll view. This scroll view, we're going to go ahead and scale up to whatever size we want it to be. So my scroll view is going to fit the dark theme, and I'm going to make sure that the bars here are darkened as well by changing the color of the handles. Now, inside of content, let's go ahead and make sure that the content has a vertical layout group to it, because we want all our elements organized vertically. If you want, you could even make two children inside of here, which would be a left column and a right column, and you could have those columns maybe organized as the content is a horizontal view, and then you just add more columns as you need to. They automatically align, and the columns themselves would be vertical. That's always a possibility, but I'm just going to stick to one vertical layout group here. So that's that, and let's go ahead and add a title. So UI TextMesh Pro, and there's my title. It is offset a little bit, so let me go ahead and adjust this. We'll go ahead and set the spacing to 35, and from the top, I'm going to move it down about 20. And so maybe I'll do the same thing for the bottom. Okay, so this title is just going to be for the general settings. So you notice off the bat that the text needs to expand a little bit. So inside of content, we've got a couple different ways we can do this. We can either make one vertical layout group where all of our settings just go down the list, or we can separate it into columns. And we can have a left side and we can have a right side. I think I'm going to go for that route because that gives more flexibility and it gives more options for aesthetic and making just things look better. So I'm going to create two columns. So inside of content, I'm going to create an empty. And this empty is just going to be basically half the size of the content container. And this will be my left column. So left column. And then content, I'm going to set it to have a horizontal layout group, where the left column will be in one spot and the right column will be in another. Let's go ahead and make sure we duplicate that, and we should have the left column on one side and the right on the other. And the left and the right column, these need to have a vertical layout group to them. So now if I were to go ahead and create some text in both of these columns, then what you can see is we get them lining up the way that they should, and we can just go ahead and create however many that we want. As you can see, I've created 3 columns, and if you want a third one visible, just make sure that you have the horizontal layout group say control child size width. So that way it will make sure that they all fit within the container. But I'm going to stick with just the left and the right column. I've just gone ahead and hidden everything on the right panel because I'm not going to use it right now. But on the left side, let me go ahead and make my title. This panel is for the general settings. Now, I've deleted the text because the way that I'm going to create elements in here is I'm going to create a container for the elements, and then I'll just basically have anything that's a part of each element contained within its own container. So that way, if we have something, say, like display settings, and it may have multiple choices to it, if it's a drop-down, that's one thing, but if you have multiple buttons, they all need to be a child of something. So that's going to be the element that we'll be making. So in my left column, I'll make yet another empty, and just scale it horizontally to fit. And this will be the container. So inside of the container, now I will add my text object and just scale that how I want it. So it'll fit inside the container, and I'll go and set the anchors to match, and then just set this to some sort of title, which will be general settings. After customizing that a little bit, I'll go ahead and duplicate now. So let me make sure the left and right column have some padding on them, and also I'm going to uncheck child force expand height. So that way it's not going to just space them out to fill the available space. It's going to space them just enough to be on top of each other. Which means if I come back into edit mode, if I were to resize one of these containers, then it will allow the ones below it or above it to just move up and down. So you can control things manually if you so choose and get the desired appearance. If you even wanted, you could create something like a spacer and then add that between the objects and then scale that, and you can configure how much space you want between your settings. If it's going to be different between like headers. So you would have your title header and maybe you could have a spacer or what have you. You just do whatever you want. So adding to my settings menu here, I've got a setting for display where I have 2 buttons to choose either full screen or windowed mode. I've got a selection for resolution, which is using a drop down in the UI menu. You can access that by going to UI. So if we were to look at this, we can see that each one of these things is just a separate object inside of the column. So literally you can add whatever you want and they will resize and position themselves. So the resolution is using a TextMesh Pro drop-down item, which you could add by going to UI and drop down TextMesh Pro. And then I will have different resolutions as the options inside of here. Those options are inside of the drop-down at the very bottom where you have options. Currently, I've only set up 1920 by 1080, but we'll set the rest up when we actually configure the functionality for this. Next, we've got an option to continue skipping after a choice if we were skipping up to that choice. So this is often used in a visual novel where if you reach a choice, it may stop skipping afterwards. So we just got the option to set that here. Then, of course, we can modify our text speed for the architect, as well as the auto read speed. Next, for the audio settings, when we click on the audio button that will take us to this tab, of course the functionality is not working yet, we'll do that later. Now we're just setting up the UI. So in the audio settings panel, I have a section with sliders for the music, sound effects, and voices. And we have a slider that'll take us from low to high, as well as a button with a little audio symbol to mute or not. We'll swap out this symbol for something to show us whether we are playing sounds or whether we are muted. So we'll be able to click that button and then easily turn off our volumes from one state to the other. Whenever these menus are disabled, we're going to mess with their content container directly under the page. So for config, content is going to have the alpha set to 0 when it's not active, and it's also going to have interactable and blocks raycast set to false. That way it doesn't hinder any functionality with the panels below it. And we do the same thing with help and whatever other sort of pages we may have. So now let's set up our save and load menu. First, I'll start by making text, which will show that we are on the file menu. Next, I'll place a panel which will almost cover the whole area designated for this menu. The top section I'm going to leave empty because we're going to assign a little panel here where we can move through the different pages of our file selection menu. So I'm going to call this my elements. And then in a darker color, I'm going to make my page navigation menu. Next, I'll begin with the pages that will designate the columns for each one of the save files. So we'll have 3 on the left side and 3 save files on the right side. And then our header menu up here will allow us to go from page to page and access different files and show them in these columns. So we will have the left side and the right side. Make sure that for both of these, we add a vertical layout group and set the padding to something. I'm going to set my padding to something along the lines of 15 on all the edges, as well as 15 as a space between each file that will be represented. And I don't need the color, so I'll just disable the image. Next, I'll add an image into the left column, which will represent our first save slot. And we want to make sure that for both the columns, we also check that they will control the child width, that way they scale to the appropriate size. So I can have my save file here, and we can stack about 3 of them inside of this whole panel. Now you'll notice that when I have only 2 on there, it tries to fill up the whole space. I don't want that. Instead, I'm going to say that it's not going to force them to expand, and it's just going to stack them on top of each other as it needs them. So then I can add the 3rd one, and we can see that these can be slightly bigger. So I will scale them up just a little bit. With the scale in place, I'll go ahead and delete the other 2 now because I don't need them, and I'll just work on this as my file slot. Next, I'll add a raw image, which is roughly the size of the resolution I'll be having on this visual novel, so because this is going to be the preview slot for the screenshot that's taken for our save files. We want it to be a raw image and not a sprite because the textures are going to be saved as a texture and not a sprite format, so that's how we'll be loading them inside of Unity. And for this image, I'm just going to select a default texture that will represent a new game. So I thought I added that as a raw image. Whoops, that's the wrong one. So for this blank file, I'm going to drag in a default new game picture that shows me there's nothing here. Then I'll have an options bar right below that, which will have my options to delete, load, and save the file. So I want to give this a horizontal layout group, obviously, and make sure that my padding is just nice for visuals. So 15 on left, 15 on right is pretty well done, and 25 for the spacing is also good. I've also chosen this to control the child size. That way, if there's no file here, I have no option to delete or load, so save would be the only thing there, and whatever buttons I have will consume the whole space. The next thing for this save slot would be something to identify the progress. We can do this with a file name and the time date stamp that this file was saved with, so we can have a little text box over here that will have all the information related to this file. This will just be a TextMesh Pro object that will be the description of the save slot, and for now it's just going to be empty. But what this will allow me to do is now I could have 3 slots here. I could duplicate and add this to my right column, and then have an additional 3 slots on the right side of the screen. So I can have 6 in total, and then let's make the buttons that will allow us to go from, say, the starting file of 1 all the way to 99 or whatever our end is going to be. We'll give our navigation menu a horizontal layout group, and we'll leave the settings alone for right now. But we'll add our first button in and just go ahead and remove the text, and then add a little image on top of the button, which is going to have a little arrow. This will indicate that we are going to move back to the previous page if the option is available to us. If it's not, this button is just going to be hidden. So let's match that up to the size of the button, and then choose to preserve the aspect on it. Then we can just scale the button down to the size that it should be. I should probably set the anchors of this thing as well, so I'll go ahead and do Control-Shift-Alt and select the entire bounds of the rect transform. Now if this is going to be a white background, then I'm going to make my image black, and I'll probably give it an outline of something like gold to stick with my color theme. So that will be our back button. We can do the same thing with our forward button, and then we have 2 buttons in our navigation menu. So let's fix their positioning. Let's go to the navigation menu to our horizontal layout group and choose from upper left to middle center. And let's also make sure that we do this. I want to make sure that the buttons match the entire height of the menu, but not match the width. So we're not going to expand them out. They're just going to stay in the center, and they'll fill up as they need. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the child elements have their own little layout components. So layout element, and we can define the min width and the preferred width of these buttons. So the minimum width will allow them to shrink down if there are too many buttons to fill the space. I don't anticipate that happening, but we'll add this in just in case. Now, I don't want these arrows to change width, so I'm going to set that to 61.55. Or I suppose, yeah, I'm going to limit it. Yeah, I'm going to limit that. Now, we're also going to have another button in here. So this button is going to be our first page. So this will be a page button. Now, instead of an image, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a UI TextMesh Pro and then set the anchors to be within that button space. This image or this text is going to be black, and I'm going to set it to auto size and make it bold. Then I'll just set it to 1, as this will represent the first page, and set the little alignment to be in the middle. So we have our first little button. And this is where we can have as many pages as we want. So by adding more page slots, we now have more navigation that we can go. So instead of just sticking to 1 page where we have 6 items, we can go to 8, which would take us all the way to 48. And then the next and previous buttons could even carry us beyond that. And now for the final step. For our canvas overlay, if you haven't already, let's make sure that we set this to scale with screen size, so that way, no matter what our resolution is, it's going to maintain all these things in their proper positions and scales. Now, we'll get it initially going way outside the bounds, so let's go ahead and just adjust our X value to where everything fits nicely inside. I'm going to hide the main canvas for a second, just so I can see everything, and it looks pretty good. So I'm going to leave it at that. So we've got our file selection menu ready, we've got our settings menu ready, and of course we have that help menu ready. So we'll go in the next video to start adding functionality to these menus.